It's great to see so many people here. And thanks again to Pierre for letting us host the event here. I think it's very fortuitous that the topic of tonight's event was something you were interested in. I remember we said, oh, you would be interested in hosting our panel on revolutionary communism, would you? And you said, no, I think I might fall asleep at that. So I probably wouldn't host it here. So yeah, I think there's been a fortuitous coincidence of interest. So I'm a member of Platypus. If you haven't heard of Platypus, we are, well, I'm going to read a little bit from our statement of purpose. So, Platypus is a project for the self-criticism, self-education, and ultimately the practical reconstitution of a Marxian left. At present, the Marxist left appears as a historical ruin. The received wisdom of today dictates that past, failed attempts at emancipation stand not as moments full of potential yet to be redeemed, but rather as what was, utopianism that was bound to end in tragedy. As critical inheritors of a vanquished tradition, Platypus contends that after the failure of the 1960s New Left and the dismantlement of the welfare state and the destruction of the Soviet Union in the 1980s and 90s, the present disorientation of the left means we can hardly claim to know the tasks and goals of social emancipation better than the utopians of the past. And for that reason, we host events such as these. And this event was organised by the London chapter. But Platypus is an international organisation. It originally started in Chicago, but now we have chapters all over the world. We have some members here from Germany, from Austria. I don't think I'm forgetting anyone. Yes, so I'm going to briefly, we have some of our journal here, which is free, if you want to take that before you leave. We also host reading groups, other panel events such as these, and coffee breaks, which are sort of aimed at students, but they happen on every Thursdays. We have a flyer, I think, here, we should do, which has information about all our events. So, without further ado, I'm going to read the panel description. So it begins with a quote from Adorno. The dynamic aspects of society are, at the same time, its static aspects. Internal conflict provides the energy for change, but no change has taken place in this respect. The economic collapse of 2008 signaled that capitalism would change yet again. It was unclear, however, how neoliberal capitalism would respond to its new conditions and what politics would steer that change. As the left today increasingly moves to uphold the status quo, the legacy of its efforts to oppose neoliberalism through movements like the anti-globalization protests of the 1990s or Occupy in 2011 is questionable. Many on the left today are calling to abandon all association with the movement, discarding identification with socialism in the history of the left, in favour of taking up popular discontents in alternative terms. This reconfiguration points to the formation of a new centre, a politics beyond left and right, or the marriage of economic progressivism or left populism with social conservatism. These tendencies take up demands that are otherwise unpopular on the left, opposing lockdowns, opposing illegal immigration, halting Western aid for Ukraine, improving public safety, or negotiating trade deals in the name of domestic workers' interests. Conservative and populist movements have no qualms about representing these demands, while the left shies away from them. A new generation is thus being politicized in these terms. How do the compounded disappointments of the past, including the left's failure to lead society out of the crisis of Fordist Keynesianism in the 1970s, haunt its politics today? What lessons can be drawn from this missed opportunity? And now I'll introduce the panelists. So we actually had Michael Roberts pull out at the last minute because he had a family emergency. So bravely stepping into his place is our Platypus member, Andreas Wintersberger, who, do you want to briefly say anything? No? Yeah. And then we have Malcolm Cheune, who, amongst other venues, has written for Unheard, Compact. He was previously involved with the Ordbro Party, though he may want to disassociate himself from that now, I'm not sure.
Really, but,
and then we have Gail Kurtz, who is in the KPO and Die Linke now. Yes. And then we have Philip Cunliffe, who you may know from the Bogacast podcast, but he also has a recent book out, Taking Control, which did anyone bring a copy of?
We have a copy available for sale.
Yeah, okay, great. So now I'm just going to quickly outline how this is going to work. Each panelist is going to have maximum 10 minutes to do their opening statement, and then they'll have up to 5 minutes to respond to each other, and then we're going to open it up to a Q&A. And what we like to do is only take one question at a time, so the panelists can actually respond. But then, if we go on for long enough, it may become more of a free-for-all. And of course, there'll be an opportunity to discuss with panelists afterwards as well. So, we're going to begin with Phil, I think. I'll let you know when you only have a couple of minutes left.
Thank you. So thank you to Adorno and to Platypus, the London chapter, for putting together the panel and for inviting me once again to speak. This time on a different but related matter of beyond left and right. So to speak to the title of the panel, Beyond Left and Right, and to think about if it's possible to get beyond left and right. I'm going to try and suggest that there might be a way to do that, possibly. So I think the defeat, I presume most people in the room, if not everyone in the room, would accept the idea that the organised labour movement of the late 20th century, the organised working class, was defeated in various ways and in various contexts, but it all happened in roughly the same period, the last quarter of the 20th century, and it took different forms in different countries. So you had the Reagan administration terminating the contracts of the air traffic controllers. You had the confrontation with the miners' union here in the UK between the Thatcher government and the miners in the middle of the 80s. You had Mitterrand's staying in the European exchange rate mechanism of the day in the early 80s, the turn to rigor, as it was called in France at the time. And so in all these different contexts, you had the disintegration of the organised labour movement, the political defeat of its representatives, and also the gradual dislocation and decimation of the working class, both in terms of its organised associational forms of life, its political forms, radical as well, and also its life as well, as part of the deindustrialisation that would take off with globalisation. And then all of this was obviously sealed with the defeat of the Soviet Union, which eliminated the practical existence of another ideological competitor or alternative to existing liberal capitalism. So I think all of that is well understood, but one aspect of it that perhaps is less well understood is that part of that defeat, part of the way in which that defeat was orchestrated, was making state power less meaningful. So if there was a threat from the left to wield state power in the interests of the dispossessed, the disenfranchised, the working class, the proletariat, one of the ways in which they were defeated was by making state power less appealing and less relevant to politics. And that was done by diluting state power, by outsourcing state power, by making state power less meaningful, by making holding state power more of a ceremonial role rather than something that actually granted significant capacity to enforce or bring in change into society and politics. And so through that way, that was part of the way in which the defeat was inaugurated and instantiated. And this took different forms again in different places, but a pattern repeats. So the outsourcing of state power to independent regulatory agencies, the outsourcing of state power to supranational bodies, to international trade commissions, delegation and dilution of power, the development or the dilution of power, state power by devolution to regional autonomy movements, to local provinces, councils, and also, most obviously, the development of independent central banks. So one could think of it, I think, as, in a sense, as an attempt to almost to wither away the state without proletarian revolution. So a neoliberal effort, essentially, to substitute administration for politics, but without going through the recourse of working class revolution, which was the classical Marxian model of how the state would wither away. And so that was the effort, was to embed these agencies of administration into the ordinary functioning of market society. And that's what's happened, and that is an important part of how you go beyond left and right. Because if there's no power to fight over, if there's no state power over which you can battle, then left and right become less meaningful. There's less meaning to political struggle, and by its very nature it will become more hollow and more empty. And so this is when you end up with the culture wars as the substitute for politics. So you have these tremendously intense and bitter squalls that run across the face of public life and public debate, but they don't really leave any lasting imprint in terms of reorganizing state structure, in terms of reorganizing our institutional or our public life, let alone leaving significant changes to the economy or the functioning of the market or to the functioning of society. So politics becomes downstream of culture, that kind of quasi-Gramscian notion, that happens in the context of the defeat of the working class, and also in this context in which state power is made meaningless. It's hollowed out or evaporates upwards into supranational agencies, or is diluted and devolved downwards into subnational forms of more provincial and less meaningful political life. And this is very visible in Britain today. And I think in Britain we're in the extraordinary situation, which I think is unique in the Western world, in that the process of seceding from the European Union has put tremendous public scrutiny and political pressure on the British governing elite in a way that is unique in the developed world, unique in the Western world, and also puts them in a tremendous position of exposure, which they're doing their utmost to flee and to avoid. And so it's visible with the latest policies of the King's Speech, which has recently happened, which for those of you from the continent, Platypus, Germany and Austria, what happens is the King's Speech, he lays out the policy of the new government, and two important bills in that are the OBR, the new role of the OBR, and also the so-called English Devolution Bill. So what this does is it's giving greater powers to the Office of Budget Responsibility, which is a kind of arm's length body to monitor and oversee and give its imprimatur to fiscal decisions and spending decisions, public spending decisions by the British Parliament. So that Parliament has an oversight body that will oversee the way in which it conducts its public, how it decides to spend the budget. Bearing in mind, right, this is exactly what the Parliament fought for in the Civil War, to fully wrest those powers from the Crown in order that they were concentrated in the hands of the Commons. Right? And now the Commons, with a tremendous Labour majority, is devolving it to an independent body. Right? So because they don't have the supranational cover provided by the European Union, they have to find another way to avoid political responsibility by outsourcing it to an external body. At the same time, they're undertaking English devolution. And again, I don't know how many of you are following, how closely any of you follow British politics, but if you took a look at the course of Welsh and Scottish devolution recently, you would not think that devolution would be a welcome prospect for England. So the idea that devolution, after the experience of what's happened in Scotland, that it would be a good model for England, is astonishing, but nonetheless the Labour government is pursuing it. And you'll have this new kind of structure whose details are still unclear, but a kind of council for England composed of various mayoral figures and regional assemblies and whatnot. But the point will be that it will disperse power, it will diffuse power. The aim is also, one of the proposed aims, and this wasn't in the King's Speech, is to replace the House of Lords with an assembly or a council of nations between Wales, Scotland, England and Northern Ireland. So what the effect is, essentially they're trying to construct a mini European Union within the United Kingdom itself to replicate the structures of the European Union internally, to disintegrate the state internally, into these separate kind of competing political factions and groups as a way of dispersing concentrated public power, right? So they're still continuing the process, essentially, right? So all of that is to say then, how do we get, is there a way to get beyond left and right, if that's the situation? And I think there is. And the way to do it is to concentrate state power. So if we're to have meaningful politics, then there has to be meaningful state power. And that means that there has to be meaningful public authority, there has to be power concentrated in publicly accountable bodies, and you have to be willing to concentrate public power. At the risk of putting political power in the hands of our elected representatives, at the risk of a collective process of trial and error, all of these things have to be done. And this, I think, is an open question. It's not something which I think necessarily belongs to the left. In fact, I'd say it probably doesn't belong to the left. If you see what's happening at the moment with the left, the Labour government I've already outlined for you here. The Squad in America, the DSA, seems to be happy to go down with the SS Biden. They've come out in support of keeping the candidate rather than trying to replace him. And the broader radical left seems to be happy to be buried beneath the rubble of Gaza after the Israeli onslaught on Hamas. And they seem to be content with that. So I'm not saying that this is necessarily a task for what we conceive of as left or right traditionally. But certainly there are many, the classical themes of left politics are all there, for better or for worse. Self-determination, national independence, democracy, all of these themes are part of what is necessary in concentrating state power again and being willing to have public power which is meaningful and authoritative. And this is my final point. The left isn't able to do it. I don't think the populists are able to do it either, and I'll come back to that in questions and answers if people want. But I would finish by saying I'm not saying this is necessarily a return to left and right. Right? If you were able to concentrate state power and to reconfigure state authority, that it would lead you back to left and right. I wouldn't be so bold as to suggest something like that with the experience of the 20th century. But what it is necessary for is to avoid the prospect of global state failure, which I think is directly what confronts us at the moment. And so we have to be willing to accept public authority and everything that comes with it, and to live under collective rules, and to be able to unlock what the public power that comes with broad-based legitimacy and mass public consent in a way that Western states haven't been able to do for at least 40 years. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Phil. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Maybe one quick disclaimer, due to the word trouble and the Microsoft chat on yesterday, I just arrived and I'm not used to talk politics in English, so I just have to get used to find my words. I hope it will get better over the course of the evening. Normally it's hard enough for me to talk in standard German instead of the ununderstandable mountain language I grew up with. But I would try my best. I would stick to a bit to the questions we have been sent, but I'm not so sure if you have them in mind or present in any way.
They don't, but you're welcome to just read them out. That's fine.
Yeah. So that would. One of the overall questions was is capitalism changing today? So what does it mean? What does it mean to the left? And I would say that capitalism is changing is a core principle of capitalism itself. Otherwise, it wouldn't have survived over the years. And so you can answer this question at any time with yes. For example, at the moment there's a shift towards from burning fossil fuels to other forms of destructions of our livelihood, but of course the core principles of capitalism stay the same. And to the questions, what do we make of the following attempted interventions in neoliberal capitalism from the left? We have been asked globalization, anti-globalization, WTO in 1999, Occupy Wall Street and the attempts to gain power in some parties, Sanders, Corbyn, for example. What I make of all those examples we've been given in the questions, for most of them, I was too young to have them experienced by myself, or at least for some of them. But I would make of almost all of them is that people were trying to make shortcuts for a way to power, and you just can't do it if you're lacking of a class base, if you're lacking of a broad organized mass movement, if you're not doing all the long year work to organize workers. You can't just like take a party, lead it, and then change everything. It won't work. I think that I'm not just. Maybe we could just like read the questions, because I was thinking we were discussing along these questions, and I don't think it doesn't make a lot of sense if I answer questions none of you has ever read before. So maybe I don't know.
Yes.
I don't know how you guys prepared, but maybe it does make sense to shortly read the rest of the questions, and then we're like all on the same level, because otherwise it's a bit weird if I'm answering questions.
Okay,
no
sure.
one else is asking.
Yeah, I'll do that right now. I mean, you've already answered a couple of them. Is capitalism changing today? If so, how? And you've already talked about this question. What did you make of the following attempted interventions in neoliberal capitalism from the left? Did the left fail? If so, how and why? And then the first is anti-globalization, anti-WTO protests, and the broader anti-globalization movement. Second, Occupy Wall Street and the anti-austerity movement of the early 2010s. Sanders and Corbyn, which are kind of a stand-in for left populism more generally, or a kind of neo-social democracy in 2015 and 2016. Why did the left's attempt to offer an alternative, a left-wing alternative to right-wing populism fail? And then the others are, what does it mean to demand change from the left today? And how did capitalism change from the Fordist Keynesian period to neoliberalism? How did it remain the same?
Okay, thank you. So, to the question, what's left of the left? I think we have so many people identifying of being left-wing, but so few people escalating the questions. Left people were like, what is the core of left politics? So we have so many people identifying as left-wing and doing identity politics, symbolic politics, fighting culture wars, and so few people escalating class struggle. What I would say is the thing you would do if you're left. Also, for the topics you just read, it's like the same thing. You could do so much with the topics like inflation and healthcare, and it's the fact that we have so much wealth in this country, in the whole EU, and the whole world, and so few people are having any advantage from it. You could escalate it so well, but because no one does it in an organized way, it is able to divide us along questions of, for example, of migration. To divide the class between those who are born here and born somewhere else. These questions are designed to distract us from the actual questions, to divide the class, and the right is only able to do so because we are not escalating the only question that is ever escalated by the left, and it is the question or the fight between labor and capital, the fight between the bottom and the top. So this is what I would say, what I am focusing in my work and with the Communist Party in Austria, where I've been for the last month, what we're doing. And for just one example to end with, we are trying to take back the topics that are discussed to our ground. We were talking about social housing and affordable rents for years. We were making this the #1 topic in the city of Austria, where I've been, where I co-organized the election campaign. And in the end, even the far-right candidate didn't have any other choice than talking about social housing and affordable rents, because this is what everyone else was doing, because this is what we were doing all the day, and doing all the organizing work around that topic. And so I would say this is core left and right. So I'm not interested in like going beyond left and right, but going back to what I think is the core of being left, and what hasn't been done for so long from so many people.
Can I just quickly add a little question then, because you have a little bit of time left.
Sure.
In light of that, if you're saying you're going back to something that was perhaps an older kind of left, what are your opinions on people who are like consider themselves to be leftists today, right? Because I've read some of your interviews, and one of your sort of taglines is like a real left politics is not for leftists. It's actually just for all sorts of people, right? And some of those people might be people who had previously voted for the Freedom Party, for example. If you could say a bit about who they are as well.
Yeah, for example, with the last election in the city of Salzburg, the Communist Party gained 23%, compared to 3% with the last election 5 years before. Most voters were non-voters before, many voters were right voters before, and this is the people we aim for, because this is the people who are in need for a functioning left, to care for them and their everyday life problems. So this is what we did. The areas where many people didn't vote or voted for the right, are the areas where we have been present all day. And because we're not doing this for our people, for the few people who identify as left already, because that is not enough to change anything. So if you take yourself serious, you have to aim for the common interest of the 99%, and not for the applause of the few left people in the room.
Thank you very much. Malcolm,
Okay.
itching to go.
Yeah. Cool. So now I have the mic. I just need to figure out what I'm actually supposed to talk about.
Is the microphone on?
I think so. Yeah. Well, let's see. Yeah. Okay. I'll do the smart thing here, and I'll start and end this little talk with quotes from great famous people, because I hear that's really the way to lend some gravitas to what you're about to say. So I'll start with the least impressive thinker of the two here, Vladimir Lenin. And he has this sort of famous quote, which I don't recall like verbatim, so I'll just talk about it. It's pretty well known. Like, he likens the task of building communism to climbing up a mountain. And the problem with climbing up a mountain is that sometimes if you pick the wrong cliff face to try to scale, you get like 80% of the way to the summit, and then you realize there's actually no way to get from where you climbed up to the actual summit. And then suddenly you're faced with the really unappetizing prospect of climbing down to the ground again and trying from another direction. But that's the task of any true communist, is to realize, okay, well, we done fucked up and we have to start over again. I often think about that quote in the context of like my own personal political experience here, because as someone who kind of came of age politically, became interested in it at the start of the Occupy Wall Street movement. I've seen quite a lot at this point. We started with the Occupy Wall Street movement, and you had also, this is kind of forgotten today, but you had people like occupying state capitals in like Wisconsin and stuff like that, as part of like the social movement for economic justice and so on and so forth. Basically the argument was like, we're tired of neoliberalism and we're tired of cutbacks and, you know, social inequality and so on. We're going to take back control. Well, that's not really how it turned out as things, you know, as time went on. And we moved from that to sort of like the big issue being the Euro crisis, the way that Greece was treated by the Troika, like the European institutions, and the attempt to sort of reclaim state power, reclaim political power in the face of like this uncaring bureaucracy and like neoliberal logic. We had people like Mark Fisher write about capitalist realism, how it's impossible to imagine. It's easier to imagine the end of the universe than a change in like how the political economy is structured. And so we went from that, we had the migration crisis, then we had sort of the right dipping its toes into some sort of labor populism. And I was actually kind of a close observer, sort of a ringer or an outside consultant for some of that stuff, both in Europe as well as in America. So I got a pretty close look from the inside of these attempts. And there were some, you know, the same sort of hopes, I would say, as you had in like left attempts to recreate politics. But in the same way, these attempts on the right became incredibly quickly bogged down into confusion, into not knowing where to go. I can take one specific example here from the American scene. The example of American Compass, which is kind of like this pro-labor organization, actually ran by the former campaign manager of Mitt Romney, who is an economist, who had like this come to Jesus moment in like 2016 or whatever. And he, for a couple of years, really tried hard to lobby for like a sort of more corporativism, more giving power to unions and so on, having like an industrial policy, etc., etc. And today he's kind of, you know, he's kind of checked out. Not in the sense that he doesn't believe these things are good or anything, but just like it's like the dream is kind of dead, to quote from Magneto in X-Men. And it's actually really fascinating the reason why the dream is dead, because what one gets the sense today is that most of these old struggles against uncaring neoliberalism or against like the evil and selfishness of EU institutions, all of them have been kind of obviated by events. And by that I mean, if you have a small problem, like for example, like zoning restrictions in this particular area of London, and then for some reason we enter into a period of nuclear war, and you know someone drops a 50 kiloton hydrogen bomb on this neighborhood, like zoning laws is not going to be particularly like something we really care about, because the entire neighborhood will have been incinerated at that point and we'll probably all be dead. But in the same way, talking about like the unfairness of the Eurozone at a point where like the European project itself is under such heavy strain from deindustrialization, from basically putting all the chips in, but winning the war over Ukraine, and now being pretty close to having to admit that they lost. Like going full tilt into some sort of incipient trade war with China, that's also going to be lost, spoiler alert. Like at that point, it's not about the getting Greece to get a better deal inside this institution. The problem is that the institution itself is about to probably not, go the way of the horse in Animal Farm, like it's going to be sent off to the glue factory. And this is an even bigger problem inside the United States. Like all political discussion today inside the United States has this big sort of Damocles hanging above it, which is the completely unsustainable fiscal situation. At this point, like a third of government revenue is going to interest payments. And like on a normal month, maybe the US collects like $320 billion or whatever in taxes and like everything brings in. 100 billion goes to interest payments. And then it has expenditures of like 650 billion. So it has to borrow like 50% of what it actually spends. And at this pace, maybe it's going to take 15 years or something until there will be $0 for anything. $0 for roads, for military, for healthcare, for food stamps, stuff like that. Everyone kind of realizes that all talk about like we need to invest in bridges, blah 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 blah. We need to colonize space. No, it's not going to happen. At least on this side of some sort of like political economic collapse, because you can't actually have huge expenditures and then $0 for it, and you can't keep borrowing forever, even if you can print money. Like we have historical precedent for that. And so like the horizon of possibility here is something that like all of these old struggles kind of seem less relevant insofar as if you want to take control of the state, or if you want to make the state stronger, you actually have to know how to run that thing. And that is something that is being lost, not just among sort of leftists who, apart from the Platypus Society, probably couldn't order like a piss up in a brewery at this point. But there are always, great exceptions and so on. But in general, like the left, people probably don't feel like a lot of confidence in them running like the American empire or whatever. Well, the people that are running the American empire don't know how to run the American empire either. The people running the American military, and I have kind of, like for some reason I get invited to DC to hold talks with like people inside the US Army and so on. Yeah. Yeah, sure. I'm getting to the closing quote, almost. But like, everyone is kind of in this situation today where the problems are so big, and they're on this kind of existential level, where there is no adult in the room, there is no sort of controlling force, there is no Wizard of Oz that you can go and make the most. Like, the system is kind of failing on its own. And just quickly, the same is true of like welfare systems. Welfare systems were designed in Europe to deal with a world where you have positive population growth and positive economic growth. If you take away those things, these welfare systems cannot function in the long term. And in fact, they become incredibly like pernicious. They become anti-solidaristic because they become very unfair for the people at the bottom still paying in. And nobody on the left that I've talked to, nobody on the right either, like nobody has any idea how to deal with like the structural incompatibility of welfare systems with like population contraction. And so like the time for this sort of left versus right, like I want more money for these systems, but you don't want money for these systems. Like people need to take a step back and talk about like basic sort of regime level issues, because these machines have got serious problems. And so thus I come to the final quote from the famous warrior poet Fred Durst of Limp Bizkit, who once uttered the fateful words, "It's just one of those days when you don't want to wake up. Everything's fucked, everything sucks. You don't really know why, but you want to justify ripping someone's head off."
Thank you.
Yeah, okay, it's hard to follow that one. Although I think I actually have the perfect quote to respond to that, but before I get there, I want to just say briefly that like Stanley mentioned before, I wrote this opening statement pretty much on the fly since we decided yesterday evening that I'm gonna fill in. So I just want to mention that, or I just want to emphasize that nothing of what I'm going to say, I presuppose, is self-explanatory. And I'm gonna do a few like significant shortcuts, like terminological shortcuts. And I really want to emphasize again, like, you guys need to question what I'm saying. Like, this is not self-explanatory. All right. So in the spirit of, gravitas,
Great thinkers.
in the spirit of great thinkers, but like in the spirit of the current moment, I'm actually gonna start my opening remarks by a quote from Otto von Bismarck. I don't know if you guys know German.
It's not quite at the same level.
Well, it's his own way of like being a warrior poet, I guess. So here's a quote. You can't create anything yourself. You can only wait until you hear the footstep of God echoing through the events, then leap forward and grab the tip of his cloak. That's all. All right, so that's Otto von Bismarck. Yeah, so I'm gonna start reading another quote to get to the topic of the discussion to the left, but also and specifically to Platypus and what Platypus is and why we are interested in asking and discussing these questions. So I'm going to quote from one of the founding texts of the Platypus affiliated society, which is called Capital and History. And I quote, "We in Platypus focus on the history of the left because we think that the narrative one tells about this history is in fact one's theory of the present. Implicitly or explicitly, in one's conception of the history of the left is an account of how the present came to be. By focusing on the history of the left, or by adopting a left-centric view of history, we hypothesize that the most important determinations of the present are the result of what the left has done or failed to do historically. And I repeat, the most important determinations of the present are the result of what the left has done or failed to do historically. So what would that mean in the face of the unfolding crisis of the fundamental conditions of social life in capitalism we are witnessing right now in the ongoing crisis of neoliberalism, with President Trump being, shot at last week. So Platypus does not choose this approach arbitrarily. We assume that the current disorientation of the left, which was mentioned now a couple of times, that is its practical and theoretical impotence in the struggle for socialism, is largely self-inflicted. For over 100 years, the left has failed to productively take up the task of social emancipation. The historical potential of the Marxist labor movement at the beginning of the 20th century haunts the present. Its failure remains unsurpassed and, as such, blocks the recognition of the problem and its depth in the present through dogmatizations and thought taboos. We want to forget this history, but we cannot. We want to remember this history, but we cannot. History as the meaning of the past for the present becomes pathological, that is, it becomes morbid. So, as symptoms of a failed tradition, let us dare to take a look at the conditions of our practical and theoretical impotence today. Perhaps we can at least succeed in transforming hysterical misery into common unhappiness, as a new generation is currently being politicized. So, but to take a step back, what is the left? Or what was the left? With the beheading of Louis XVI 230 years ago by the social forces of the French Revolution, the French Revolution, which was itself a relatively late symptom of the bourgeois revolution, a need for a new political differentiation arose. A new political differentiation which was never seen in history before, and that is the left and the right. It was the concept of bourgeois society characterized by radical bourgeois thinkers such as Rousseau and Adam Smith. They characterized this concept by the emancipative potential of social labor for the free self-transformation of society that gave birth to the left. So it was the concept of bourgeois society that gave birth to the left. The left itself was a historical phenomenon. That means it could not be defined by a supra-historical set of moral principles, such as, for example, the struggle of the oppressed against the oppressors. But it represented, like the left represented, the concrete reaction to a historical tendency, a reaction to the massive transformations of human existence which now demanded their conscious political expressions. In other words, revolution was a given, but who was to lead it and where? Was it a matter of moderating the potential and the very real dangers posed by the forces emerging from the bosom of cooperating society in order to minimize their damage? Or was it a matter of radically advancing these forces from the tennis court oath to the Jacobin Committee of Public Safety, meaning advancing these forces as freedom realizing itself in the world? With the emergence of the epoch of capital in the 19th century, a new contradiction within the bourgeois revolution appeared, bringing with it a new contradiction for the left. And now I'm quoting again from Capital and History. With Marx in the 19th century came the realization that bourgeois society, along with all its categories of subjectivity, including its valorization of labor, might itself be transitional. That the end goal of humanity might not be found in the productive individual of bourgeois theory and practice, but that this society might point beyond itself towards a potential qualitative transformation at least as profound as that which separated the peasant way of life from the urban proletarian one. Indeed, a transition more on the order of profundity of the Neolithic revolution in agriculture that ended hunter-gatherer society 10,000 years ago, more profound than that which separated modern from traditional society. End of quote. So it is from this perspective of the last 10,000 years, since the Neolithic revolution, that I want to zoom back into the history of the millennial left of the last, let's say, 20 years. And zoom back into the present characterized by the demise of the millennial left, which, I mean, I'm asking this as a question, but to the present, which is characterized by the demise of the millennial left, which seems to point us to the right. I mean, which is a question I'm kind of like posing to you guys as well. So, if that's true, I want to quote again from an article that we have published in our newspaper, the Platypus Review. Oh shit. Okay, I'm gonna read it a bit more quickly. It's from December 2021, written by a member of Platypus, Danny Jacobs. And I quote, "Platypus's interest in the left follows from how the left bears the failure of the proletarian socialist revolution and really the memory of utopia when it reaches for the history of the left to justify its practices today. The right doesn't have this history because it did not try to lead and emancipate the world. It doesn't relate to these past practices as having anything to do with it. So the right doesn't relate to these practices. This does not preclude the right from holding values such as liberty or cosmopolitanism that the historical left had upheld. But this means they can only serve as a foil, that means a reminder. For example, Marx told his followers that their internationalism was even infinitely below that of the Free Trade Party. But what, end of quote. But what one learns from the right today is primarily how an opportunity was missed. It is purely negative. So I'm gonna skip the rest of the quote and come to the end here. So I want to ask, like the panelists, but also the audience, what would it mean to understand the current left, meaning like the present, viewed through the lens of the left, as conditioned by a missed opportunity? And I'm going to end here with a quote as well. This time it's from another article from the PR, which was written or published 10 years before the one I just quoted. So it was published in December 2011. It's by Chris Cutrone, and it's called A Cry of Protest Before Accommodation. And it was actually very much in the context of Occupy. And I quote, "If we imagine that history is on our side, we threaten to rationalize a course of change already underway that we have yet to control. Our protest against it may already be our resignation to it, in the guise of calling us to task. The world is changing. The question is whether and how we are a function of that change." End of quote. My last sentence, the question is the concept of the left today at the end of neoliberalism. Thanks.
Okay, thank you to all the speakers. We're now going to have some time for you to respond to each other's opening statements. You'll get about 5 minutes each. Again, I'll tell you when you have a couple of minutes left. So should we just go in the same order? We'll start with Phil.
So I suppose I would say a couple of things in relation, perhaps most directly to some of the things that have been raised. I think the issue or part of the problem with the Cutronist take on the defeat of the left is to understand it as a kind of frozen issue of the last 100 years, and in intellectual and political terms, rather than seeing how its evolution has impacted and altered actual social structure and social dynamics. And what I mean by that is that what's happening recently is not simply a matter of missed opportunities or political mistakes or falling short of some grand historic goal. Very clearly the link between the middle class, left-wing middle classes, white-collar kind of liberals, the professional managerial class and the working class, that alliance that was bound together in the social democratic parties of the 20th century, what is striking about what's happened most recently is that it's fallen apart. And that was maintained over the course of the 20th century, despite all of the terrible storms and conflicts and defeats of that period. It's only disintegrated actually in the last 20 or 30 years. And this is part of the phenomenon of populism, that you have figures like Trump, like the Freiheitpartei in Austria, like Boris Johnson, at least in his initial victory in 2019, of taking away working class voters from their traditional Labour base. And so this is something new, and it reflects, I think, a sociological phenomenon as much as a kind of accumulated weight of political defeat. And that sociological phenomenon is tied into atomization, tied into the lack of civic associational life, tied into forces of demodernization and social disintegration. And so that is something which is specific to our current moment. It's not something which is simply bound up with these kind of complex movements and abstract dialectics stemming back from 1848. So that leaves us with, I think, distinctive problems. And so if working class politics means something, then it means engaging with the existing working class, if it is to mean anything at all, and not the kind of idealized abstractions inherited from the past, particularly if we accept that the tasks which have been historically set before the left, or which the left set before itself, if those have ended. And so this takes me to this question, I suppose, raised by Malcolm about the idea of state failure. I think we have a very concrete I don't think it necessarily needs to take the form of some kind of gruesome apocalypse. I think the heightened risk of nuclear war over the geopolitical blunders in Ukraine, that's a real thing, and I wouldn't wish to diminish its historic significance, but I still think at the end of the day, it's still objectively not especially likely. I think we have a very good paradigm of what state failure looks like, which was global lockdown, the beginning of something like a global police state, and that was an artifact of the lack of state capacity. So the reason they had to lock everyone up was because there wasn't simply, they didn't have the underlying health infrastructure, whether that be in social democratic Sweden, to the Britain's NHS, to America. They simply didn't have a health capacity to deal with the figures that they were seeing, and it seemed that the best way to respond to it was to arrest everyone, right? Save the NHS was the slogan. The SWP slogan was taken by the Tories to justify rolling out a police state with lockdown here in Britain, right? Everyone stay at home, you're under house arrest in order to save the NHS. And so that, I think, is a paradigm of what state failure looks like. Authoritarian responses and control over public life in response to the lack of capacity to deal with the kinds of problems that we're confronting at the moment. And so the issue is not one of, and I'll finish on this, the issue isn't just one of technical competence among our managerial elite, so there's plenty, there's certainly an absence of it, but also about legitimacy and authority. And those are, strictly speaking, political questions. Those aren't questions of technical competence in knowing how to run a hospital or a large public organization. That is a question that concerns all of us, and it's a political question. And that's a question that we can actually address even without great technical competence.
Perfect. Wanted to say something similar to Malcolm. A few quick words. I would agree that the question is not a lack of competence. I would say that the explanations you gave for the whole fuck up were, I would say, pretty liberal explanations, and I would say that for example, the reason why the welfare system is so broken is not that there's not enough people paying, but that, for example, the money I'm paying for healthcare insurance is going directly to a few huge companies who are taking out billions every year from the system, and of course this money is missing then in the system to make people healthy. Or, for example, with the war in Ukraine, if you want to stop Putin, you have to stop the oligarchs profiting from the war, but the elites in Europe don't want any sanctions that are really hurting them, because they're hiding their money in the same corporations and in the same places in Europe, and all over the world, where our own elites are hiding their money and want this money to be hidden there. So I would say it's not just like, there are so many incompetent leaders and we're just fucked up, but there's people actively fucking up, and it's not like there's no adults in the room. The problem is that there are, and they're profiting from how everything works. And I think, of course, reality is way more complex than the easy explanations I'm giving right now, but without them, I would say you are not able to fully understand the situation. My 2 cents.
All right. I think that we can sort of start here with the point about welfare systems. So I categorically disagree with your characterization of this, because at the basic level, a welfare system is kind of like, and this is a sort of negatively coded term, but it's accurate in this sense. A welfare system functions akin to a pyramid scheme, in the sense that if you are 65 years old, you are not drawing welfare benefits from some sort of pot of gold, a big sort of, what's the word? You have this pig-shaped thing you put coins into. The state doesn't save resources that you then consume. Your welfare is a claim on the productive labor of people who are 25 years old. And so what happens if you have a population contraction is that the claims on the working 25-year-old get higher and higher. Meanwhile, when that 25-year-old gets to the point of him being 65 and needing to draw on the working population of 25-year-olds, he's going to be getting a lot less than what he put in. Again, this is not you putting away resources and then, coming back to the storage of resources later. So the point here is that no matter how much you eliminate waste, and that's something everyone in this room can agree with, even a Grinch like me, we should always eliminate waste in sort of public resources. And if there are people profiteering, which there obviously are, and it's a problem that's getting way worse, those people shouldn't be allowed to do that. But even taking that into account, this is a principle, this is a basic question of sort of justice, equality, and moral principles. Because, again, it's not a slam dunk to tell a 25-year-old, you're going to be paying 60% in taxes or whatever, or 65, because we have a lot of old people, and when you get old, we're just going to send you to the Soylent Green tax. That's not an emancipatory system. I'm sorry. Okay, you're going to be living in a tent or whatever, but while you're still working, you're going to be paying a shit ton of money so that other people don't have to live in tents. So again, I find that my position here, and I want to make this completely clear, I'm not someone saying welfare systems are bad, workers have had it too good for too long and it's time to have some discipline. I'm just saying people need to be honest about these very basic structural questions. I come from a position where I want old people in the future and old people now to not face a completely miserable existence. But what we have in a country like Sweden is a system, it's kind of like an airplane. It has a certain speed it has to go in order to keep itself up in the air. And if you don't have that speed, it's not built to work. The Swedish welfare system is straight up not built to work with 0.0% GDP growth per annum, and then a population contraction, which you get when you have a nativity of 1.3 kids per woman. It was never designed by the Social Democrats to work under those conditions.
2 minutes.
Yeah, sorry?
2 minutes.
Yeah, and so anyone who just says to working people and to old people that don't worry, it's all about these scary capitalists that are putting their money into your savings account and taking it out, at some point you are going to be the person who has to make good on your claims. And given that it's not even an open secret, it's openly admitted that this isn't a problem that you solve merely by saying, well, there are some greedy people out there. You're not being honest. And these sort of problems of basic state functions are getting worse by the year. I actually have pretty good sort of contacts inside a city like Washington, D.C. for some ungodly reason. I can't even tell you why these people talk to me or take me seriously. I certainly hope you guys don't. But the thing I'm hearing, and I'll just end on this point, they're not good. And the problem with the left for a long time is that it's been kind of parasitical. It's like this rebellious teenager who still knows that there's a father figure there. You can call him all kinds of names. You can scream, "Fuck you, Dad, I never loved you anyway." But you know that when you're ready to come back, or your plan to become an artist or whatever doesn't work out, he's always going to be there and he's going to have a plan. There's no fucking plan in Washington, D.C. Sorry, Dad's not home, Dad's gone, he's thrown in the towel, he's pushing up the daisies. None of these people in quote-unquote authority really know how to keep the system going under present conditions.
Yeah, thanks everyone. I think I'd like to own up to Phil's criticism. I'm gonna go for the abstraction on this one, because it's I know it's really, really interesting and at the same time trippy, like to me, how like each of you has a politics, which I think is something that we need to be explicit about, and how each of your politics is actually grounded in a certain conception of like ideas, theories coming out of the history of the left. I mean, which seem to be, and that's another interesting thing I kind of want to draw out, very much about the state. Like, Phil, you mentioned that or you emphasized the meaning of the end of the Soviet Union for present, right? The end of I think you call it competitor, an ideological competitor to liberal capitalism, which I think is something that is not at all obvious. You know, whether the end of the Soviet Union was really that, you know, much of a conditioning factor for the present situation when it comes to the left, especially if we want to, you know, draw ideas from, like you did, Malcolm, Lenin. Like, you said, you know, you quoted Lenin in Notes from a Publicist about, you know, the climbing of high mountains. So there is this, like, seemingly implicit reference to clearly leftist ideas and history that to me is not at all obvious, like why you guys think the way you do. And Gail, you said that it's a core issue of the left to escalate class war. Like, which I think, you know, it's not at all clear to me what that means. Like, is class war really the same as the struggle of the oppressed, you know, against the oppressor? Or sorry, no, that wasn't the word you used. You said the 99%, right? What is a class in that sense? Like, what do we make of the category of class vis-a-vis the state, which you all seem to say is in a crisis at the moment, is failing? Like, and this is another thing I want to emphasize, which I find interesting, that Phil and Malcolm, you both seem to suggest that we are on a retreat right now. Like, Phil, you said, what was it? That, yeah, we have to accept state authority to avoid the prospect of global state failure. So, and obviously, the question would be what kind of state authority, right? Then, Malcolm, you raised the question of, okay, like, the left is not ready to run the state. Well, why should we? Like, what would be...
Yeah, that's a good question.
Right, so, my point is, you know, like, obviously, you all have historical assumptions about your politics. And I want to draw out how these, you know, references to the history of the left, which are the reasons why you guys are thinking the way you are thinking, why you guys are doing what you're doing, how these ideas are conditioned by our current historical moment. And that is, I think, the end of a political cycle, you can call it, the end of the millennial left, a missed opportunity, which is, you know, why I ended there with my opening statement.
Thanks very much. Do we want to go into an immediate response to that, or do we now want to go into the Q&A? Should we go into the Q&A? I think Pierre's going to control the mic.
Yeah, I'm going to be a mic point. I'm going to steal attention. I think you need probably one more microphone there. So that's sitting there. Hand it over to Stanley. So I'm going to record your hands, but I'm going to ask the first question if you're ready.
Go for it. Yeah, we're ready.
Yeah, such is the privilege of holding the microphone. Andreas, I'm kind of shocked that I'm really, really aligned with a lot of your line of questioning, almost to the end, where you've suddenly uncovered that everyone is indeed a leftist, whether they want to or not. And I use the term leftist sort of loosely to not necessarily describe present company. But one of the things that we kept on trying to discuss as we pitched the panel and how we were trying to shape the way we communicated is exactly, once you've asked the question of beyond left and right, what do we do with the right? And I'm completely aligned with Malcolm's doomerism. I don't think the right really know what they're doing. I'm surprised to hear from Gail that indeed the far-right party and the Communist Party can be aligned on social housing. But if we take seriously the thing that's kind of implied in the writing that you did about the panel, this spectre of populism, whether it's really to do with social housing or whether it's to do with migration or Ukraine, is there something to be derived from looking at how the right has arrived at exactly the same stalemate as the left? And I want to pose that question to you, sort of echoing the way that you phrased it, because I think it does really bear answering. What is it in the conservative political tradition, intellectually, not just the kind of failed status that Phil responded to? What is it that has led to the kind of opportunistic adoption of populism by the right, for both good and bad? And what is it that's actually being missed here? And there's one of the reasons that I've invited quite a lot of people who I think are on the right politically is that I hope that we can have some of this discussion. After this will be my last contribution to discussion.
I'm going to add a supplementary question to that, which is the FPO really a far-right party? Is that an accurate characterization?
So I'm sorry, that's all right. Or was it was addressed to everyone, right?
Yeah, pretty much.
Right.
All questions are addressed to everyone.
Cool. So I'd like to start if that's okay. Right. Yeah, thanks for that question. I think that's an interesting one, and I want to emphasize like what I tried to say with my opening statement, and that is the historical root of the phenomenon of left and right. Like that it is not a set of moral principles, that it is not something that that is being created out of a vacuum, but in response and in reaction to historical tendencies. That means like the left, the division, of modern politics into a left and a right is an acknowledgement of a historical tendency, a kind of social development, which stems from our way of cooperation, but is opaque and obscure to us. That means like the division of the left and the right, of politics being separated into a left and a right, like the basic idea is that it is a response to a process like a process that was started by the ongoing process of the bourgeois revolution. This is, I think, a fundamental consideration that I want to push. It is in response to something. It is in response to something we have deeply forgot how to conceptualize. Should I have one more time? So this is something like I want to emphasize. And if you take that idea on board about the history of the emergence of left and right, then you can have thinkers like Leszek Kolakowski, a Marxist intellectual, which we read in Platypus, saying that the left is about advancing a historical tendency of development towards utopia, while the right is reacting to it opportunistically, while the right does not need utopia. The right can, in this sense, operate much more practically, actually, in a way. Much more opportunistically, and I don't mean that in a necessarily pejorative way. I'm just saying that, according to this historical way of thinking about left and right, the stakes for politics are always conditioned by a utopia when it comes to the left. This is what we mean when we say the left is dead today. There is no left.
Yeah, and I could probably add something to that point when we're talking about I think you're putting attention to something very central here when you talk about the historicity of the entire concept of left versus right. You had political divisions in medieval Europe, for example, and these political divisions were pretty complex, multifaceted, but you had not the left and the right, like in Germany, for example, and in northern Italy, you had the Guelphs versus the Ghibellines. which was basically like a conflict about the status of the Holy Roman Empire emperor versus the Pope. And like a lot of stuff got folded into it. It was kind of the left versus the right of that day, even though it didn't map out like on our sort of divisions at all. Because like these things are basically like they're bounded historically. And same thing with like political divisions in the Roman Republic. They weren't left versus right. Like you can probably recognize some sort of similarities. But again, they had their own time. And this is kind of where I want to be a bit provocative here. Because one of the things that sort of gives this sense among a lot of people that the left is kind of out of gas in the tank is that, again, if the Holy Roman Empire disappears, like all of the people that sort of saw their own identity in terms of like, I support the emperor versus like Caesaropapism or whatever, like they're gonna have, like being a Guelpher Ghibelline, like that stuff isn't gonna matter anymore. Like we've passed the historical point where that's relevant. And the problem here with Marxism and like the left is that it's locked into this, basically like the development of the productive forces, it's kind of a one-way process. And so it's gonna end up in like the productive forces being so advanced that we're gonna need a new human society to deal with all the good stuff we're gonna have. So we don't end up in some sort of techno like dystopia. But think about like the last 40 years. Like in the 90s, if you wrote like a cyberpunk novel about us like living in space, colonizing space, blah, 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 like having all of these robots and AIs going wild. Like in the 90s or 80s, flying cars by 2020, Mars colonies by 2020, that was kind of credible, like to be honest. Now we're living in 2020 and like the eternal march of the productive forces, it's looking less and less impressive every day. So if we're not promised this endless march of like technological improvement, maybe even like we're looking at like people getting poorer in real terms, that kind of creates a huge problem for, you know, the leftist conception of where history is going.
This makes me, no offense to Andreas, but it makes me think that it would be great if Michael Roberts was here, since he is monomaniacally obsessed with the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, which is obviously like not really in keeping with what you've just said. So yeah, can you maybe can I follow up and say, yeah, no, that's okay.
I'm gonna try to answer two, I think, misconceptions, but then I'm not so sure if this is what you want to hear from me.
So you don't have to say what you think we want to hear. Because of the far right in Austria, what I was saying is at least the leader of the right-wing party in Salzburg is pretty far right because he's organized in the Identitäre Bewegung. If that's not far right, I don't know what is. And one, I think you got me wrong. It's not that we and the right are aligned in the topic of social houses, but we made it the #1 topic in the city. So they had no other chance than talking about our topic, even if they didn't have anything to say in that. Same thing the other way around, I would say in Germany or in many other countries right now. Since the German AfD, German right-wing party, did so well in making anti-migration the #1 topic over the years, all the other parties, even if they would want to talk something completely different, have to talk about that all day. So this is like we did it the other way around with social housing, even if they don't have anything to say on that. I think we're having a bit of a strange discussion with like how fucked everything is, because I would say yes it is, but not because like for example that people in power don't know what to do or we don't have the money for a healthcare system or anything,
but because we don't have the power to decide we will have the money, for example, because it's not a real thing. In Germany, the government decided overnight, we have to win the war in Ukraine, we make up $100 billion to spend for tanks and
How many artillery shells do you actually produce?
Okay, yeah, then this is another thing then. But you said that like the system is fucked because of the money that is lacking, for example, in this. You can just make this up if you have the power to decide that you want to spend this money on the healthcare system, for example, but we don't have any power to decide anything like this, but the other side has the power to decide that all the money is spent for military, for example.
No, but they don't make any shells. They can't make them, right? Oh, sorry.
Then I don't get your point, I guess.
Yeah, but like my point was just that like these people, they're not the masters of the universe. Like, yeah, you're completely right that money is made up, you can print it and so on, but they didn't want to print money. They wanted to, through printing money, get artillery shells. And they didn't know how to do that, like they straight up categorically failed.
I would say number one goal of elites in Europe is not necessarily winning the war in Ukraine or producing as much shells as possible, but yeah, printing money for them. So this is what they're doing and what they're pretty good at. And because, as I said, I mean, there would be other options like to have a better chance to put pressure on Putin. They aren't used not because of a lack of shells, but because of a lack of interest. So this would be my point.
Thank you. I suppose in the question of the assumptions underpinning the discussion, or underpinning at least what I've been saying, I think perhaps Andreas is attributing more opacity than I could claim, and certainly wish to claim. I've been very, I began from the proposition of the defeat of the left, and saying that is at the base of the claims that I made in the scope of the talk. But this is not just a matter of the historicity of certain kinds of questions or certain kinds of political challenges, but also a practical matter of state power. There is no real meaning to left and right, or to factions within the left, or to factions within the right, if you're battling over something which has no power. If you don't have, we have a program and we're going to implement it, we're going to do these things, it doesn't mean anything if the state isn't in a position. There are no actual levers to pull when you're in power. And so that means that it's not simply a question of the archaism of left and right, but also that battles over political power don't have any real meaning. And that is part of the problem of our politics. And so it's a matter of legitimacy, of authority, of the nature of public power, of the claims about the structure of consent, of democratic authorization. Those are political problems that we confront at the moment. And to some extent, I think they are genuinely unprecedented, and they do take us beyond left and right to that extent. So it is, in addition to these questions of historicity, it is also a practical question of state power and the absence thereof. And how that makes these discussions meaningless. And this ties into Pierre's point, I think, with the experience of the Liz Truss government. So the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, the Labour Chancellor, has made a great show of saying that the powers that I spoke about earlier, that she's given to this Office for Budget Responsibility, are designed to prevent what happened with the Liz Truss government, the Tory government that was brought down by the markets. According to Liz Truss, it was the kind of woke civil servants of the deep state that brought her down, but in fact it was the integration of the central bank, an independent central bank, with the markets, and very large pension funds, kind of the oligopolistic structure of financial markets, and how they interlace with pension funds and buying British gilts and whatnot. And I mean, the details are less important than the fact that it was a very specific configuration of British capitalism in which the state doesn't have that much control or influence. And so in that context, it's definitely not the deep state which brought her down, but the powers that the state has outsourced, and that these independent agencies that are embedded into the way in which the market works. And so we have this position whereby even the kind of the libertarian vision of kind of restoring Thatcherism, there isn't enough state power to enforce a kind of revived neoliberal program, right? I mean, that's the situation that Liz Truss found herself in. The state was too weak. She didn't have the elected leader of the British state. Didn't have sufficiently concentrated power in order to roll out kind of a new program of neoliberalism. And this goes to the question of lockdown as well, which I think indicates again the kind of the scope of the unprecedented historical problems that we're confronting, because it seems to me very clear that the lockdown was a failure of a capitalist ruling class. A real capitalist ruling class would have obviously kept society functioning to keep the market going. Like if the idea of the state as the agency of the capitalist class in the classical kind of Marxian formula is the idea that the state should keep society running in the interests of capital. And that was clearly not done. You could say they locked down society for the benefit of big pharma or something, but that isn't in the interests of capitalism as a whole. It was disastrous for capitalism, right? And so it seemed to me lockdown is very, rather than kind of naked profiteering and oligarchs kind of tugging the strings or the puppet masters behind the scenes, it seemed to me that lockdown was very much an artifact of the inability for a capitalist class to exercise any collective interest and to impose any kind of collective interests on the agencies of the state. So again, reinforcing the fact that we are in a situation which it seems to me is genuinely novel, and it goes beyond the simple kind of interdependence of categories or historicity of certain kinds of questions. The good news is that there are possible solutions, right, which aren't simply ones of intellectual clarification and the sense of untangling historicity, or I think there is a lot to what Malcolm is saying about the debate, say, of the Russian Revolution and the left and the right and Bukharinist versus Genoviev and this and that. That is wealth and Gibellian stuff, right? I mean, in the sense that it has no meaningful kind of organic connection to the political questions that confront us today.
Sorry, just to quickly respond to that. I'm sorry, I'm gonna make it short. I'm very sympathetic about what you're saying about the novelty of this moment. I think you touched on something very important, and I also want to be like completely clear about why I'm here, about like what my interest in this discussion is in this project. It's the idea that like the novelty of this situation is obfuscated by the historical terminology and the concepts of the left. Leftist ideas today are an ideological obstacle to the reconstitution of emancipative politics. That is a problem you can't just escape by going to the right. That is a problem you can't just escape by calling yourself populist. That is a deep problem that can't be solved like in your head. I completely agree with you on that. You know, we have this saying in Platypus that we understand ourselves as a necessary but not sufficient condition of the reconstitution of the Marxian left. So I wanted to make that clear.
Okay, we should take questions. Where do we want to go first? Yep.
So I just want to point out that we had not only Malcolm quoting Lenin directly, but we had multiple times Lenin on this panel. One situation I do remember is Phil mentioning the withering away of the state in context of neoliberalism. So this was a moment where Lenin in 1917 actually rediscovered Marxism in the moment of taking state power in order to make the state wither away. So which in this moment was a very concrete utopia you characterized in the moment right now as an apocalyptic scenario. So while I want to push back a bit on the idea of the state withering away under neoliberalism, maybe someone else, maybe Malcolm mentioned the welfare state so much, maybe this is a moment to comment on that, because I'm actually not sure that this was really happening And what I do want to ask you is, what was the missed opportunity of neoliberalism? And what or who is the agency that drives human emancipation in history? Is it the state, or is it society, or is it something else?
There's a lot to be going on there. Who wants to go first?
You want to take it straight away?
Yeah, we take one at a time.
On the withering away of the state, I mean, I said it's kind of analogous to the idea of the withering away of the state. And I think what's been proved by it is obviously that the neoliberal effort to wither away the state is obviously failed. And that you can't do, very clearly it seems the conclusion would be that you can't do technocracy without the rule of the working class, without the rule of some, or at least even, maybe even more, in a more restrained way, without democratic majoritarianism keeping the technocrats in check. And what we're seeing now is the disintegration of that effort to depoliticize the state, of the effort to contract and outsource power, as well as kind of outsourcing industries. They outsource political power. And we're seeing the resulting fragmentation of the bureaucracy, the fragmentation of various kinds of basic technical state capacities, and their decay and decline. And here I think the bureaucratic competence and the political questions intersect, because the less power is in the state, and the less you can do with the state, then very clearly it's going to attract more mediocre people, right? I mean, from the 1990s, the smart people went into doing banking and so on. If you had a PhD in rocket science, you would go and become like a Wall Street whiz kid, kind of making up numbers and making up lots of money, right? So the other part of that is then you get more mediocre civil servants, more mediocre bureaucrats. They feel, they know, that they have less kind of public authority and input, and that vicious cycle develops over time. So when I say the withering away of the state, it's certainly not the shrinking of the state, but the attempt to substitute an apolitical technical administration for the tasks of politics. And so the question of emancipation is one that we certainly we can't do without politics for emancipation. And so from this side from where we are at the moment, we need concentrated state power. And I don't mean by that, tremendous kind of gargantuan and monolithic bureaucratic apparatuses. I mean concentrated sources of legitimacy. The sovereign state, public authority that has authoritative command over its citizens, and that the citizens are willing to obey and respond to, because they know they have the capacity to shape the choices of that state, even if they happen to disagree with a particular policy. And so that core compact, in the classical terms of the general will and the sovereign state, those things are falling apart. In addition to the technical kind of disintegration of the bureaucratic capacity of the state. So what I'm proposing is, I think certainly we could do with more bureaucratic competence, but what I'm proposing is, more strictly speaking, a political question of public authority, of sovereignty, a relationship between the ruled and the rulers, but through which you generate consent, authority, and legitimacy.
Isn't that something that could be done by capital? I'm sorry, isn't that something that could be done by capital? Like, why do we need a left for that? Or do we? We don't.
I'm saying we do need a left, yeah. But it seems to me that the capitalists are not up to it either. Like I said, I think lockdown was an example of not only a state failure, but also a failure of capital as a ruling class, that you didn't have a ruling class that was capable of keeping society functioning, even in its own partial interests, let alone a claim of a wider general interest on behalf of society as a whole.
To the question, what is the missed opportunity for the left? I don't think there is any, because there was no opportunity. Because the left failed so much in the last decades in building up any power, in organizing any parts of society, in playing any role in everyday life, in proving in any part that it makes a difference if we're here or not. and it makes anything better in not proving and not building up any trust anywhere. There was just no opportunity because of the lack of all of that. So if you're not even organizing your own neighborhood, you can't hope for miraculously changing world politics if there is a big crisis or anything and you have the right answers. That is like a kind of idealism, I would say, that's just not working. Yeah.
Well, I guess I'll just say something really quickly about like the withering away of the state. I think that, yeah, the state is kind of withering away, but that's actually kind of a cope for politicians in the sense that like they're making a virtue out of necessity here. And a good example of this is like Swedish accession to NATO. Like I have the business card of the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, the guy that's probably going to become the Secretary of Defense in Trump if he wins the election. I have his, business card. It does not have a watermark like in American Psycho, unfortunately. But like, I actually talked to him when I was last in DC, and everyone in DC, like the consensus, like the scope of acceptable opinion in DC is either we should arm Ukraine. And then once Ukraine is done, we should never spend a dollar on Europe ever again because we have to focus on China. That's like the leftist position or whatever, like the Victoria Nuland position. And then you have, we shouldn't spend another dollar on Ukraine and we should never spend a dollar on Europe ever again. Like these are the scale of disagreement here. There's no one who says, if Sweden gets into a scrap over Gotland or whatever, we should totally help these guys out. Not a single person in Washington believes that. Like, not a single person. This isn't an open secret. You can just walk over and you don't even have to buy them drinks. They will tell you straight up. Like, America has no time for defending Sweden. Like, we're way past that. And yes, Swedish politicians, because Sweden doesn't have a fucking army, it has 3 artillery pieces left or something. What they really want to do is just say, we're joining NATO so we don't control this, it's the big daddy America that's gonna settle us. We're just like these giant babies, and like babies, it's not our job, it's our parents' job to make sure that we're clothed and fed. The task of sort of formulating a strategy for national defense, of funding that, of having the discussion, it's not just politicians who don't want to have that. I don't think the Swedish people want that either, because it would be uncomfortable and it would involve a lot of sort of trade-offs that nobody's willing to make. So it's much easier to keep lying, to join this completely useless alliance if you're Sweden, because again, the Americans aren't unclear about whether they will defend you or not. They're completely honest about the fact that they won't. And yet everyone keeps pushing this lie, because admitting that Sweden, it doesn't have a military anymore, and it's not about to plan how to get back to having one. The lying at this point is just the function of a lot of this withering away of the state. It's just cope.
What about the possibility of the missed opportunity?
I mean, this is such a huge question, so maybe we can take it later, but I tend to think that maybe the missed opportunity actually was at the fall of the Soviet Union, and the way, I'm just gonna throw this out there and you can sort of think about this, but I'm kind of wondering, imagine the relationship between China and Russia today, this no holds barred partnership and so on. I think that and this is not just talking about the left, but in general about the entire political class in all of Europe. If you had said at the fall of the Soviet Union, we're gonna become best buddies, we're gonna give you this big old bear hug, and we're gonna have this incredibly close working relationship between equals and partners, and there will be no sort of looting of Russia and no sort of lectures about pride parades or whatever, no support for Boris Yeltsin sealing the election. We're gonna become the best of friends, and we're gonna have this big old economic power bloc where on the same premises that you have like China and Russia being friends today, instead of like trying to like rape the remnants of the Russian Empire or the Soviet Union, I think that like the position like politically in terms of like social provision, economic growth, all of those things, it would be completely radically different. So instead of trying to just say, we won, like this is the end of history, we're gonna be like these rapacious sort of balance looting as much of Eastern Europe as we can. If we had said like, no, we're not gonna loot you, you're gonna be our friends. I think that things like the state of play would be quite different. But that's just what I think. Like others can definitely disagree on this.
Should we take another question?
I'm going to introduce a rule, which is we're going to alternate between Platypus members and non-Platypus members.
I think that's fair.
I have a question for Phil. So you spoke about English devolution as an example of the withering away of state power, but can't more local politics also create a more vibrant associational life and sort of prevent the atomization of the working class, which you also talk about as a problem? Because it doesn't seem to me that you can create that associational life with more sort of central power.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So I'd agree with you. So as far as I can tell from the details of the English devolution bill, it's going to be some kind of council where the agenda is set by and controlled by a secretariat, which is going to be a new kind of layer of national middle management. It's going to create a whole new layer of kind of intermediate bureaucrats, kind of classic white collar labor voters. Essentially, it's jobs for Labour Party apparatchiks, essentially. And that's very different. It seems to me it will be a very kind of tightly controlled agenda and a tightly controlled forum in which mayors with responsibility but no real power or budget and other kind of local agencies will get together to discuss something which will then be handed over to somebody else, maybe back to Parliament, and Parliament will say the way that it operated in the European Union. Like Parliament says, well, our hands are tied, and then the local government, the local kind of council will say, well, our hands are tied because Parliament has come with this, and the issue is kind of batted back and forth between the two. And that's very different from, say, re-empowering local councils, or restoring, kind of taking off the limits on local councils, the austerity that was imposed on local councils by George Osborne, and empowering local councils. And that would seem to me, the latter, would seem to me not devolution, but concentrating public authority, in fact. So restoring budget and restoring power to councils and elected authorities at the local level, that would seem to me consistent with what I described in terms of a concentration of public power, rather than a program of devolving it. So it's not about, I'm not making a case for like a monolithic single centre in terms of, as if there's one single ministry where everything is routed through, but rather that all public decisions are related to a single centre of authority, but that it is democratically empowered. So what is proposed through English devolution will not be about restoring local autonomy, but introducing more layers, more veto points, and more ways to diffuse accountability on central government. Whereas the classical model, it seems to me, would be more about slotting into central government and building central authority through the cumulative effect of voting at multiple levels, where each one is kind of a piece of a larger integrated sovereign authority.
Should we take another question? Can we get one time?
Okay, I have one question for Phil and one question for Georg. So, Phil, you're saying that at some point in the 20th century, the very capacity to transform society, social agency, collapsed. And you tie this up with the institutional demise of organized labor, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the diminishing of executive power in favor of administrative power. but by saying that we can restore this social agency through asserting and expanding executive power, why are you not, as Georg said earlier, taking a quote shortcut? Is social agency and executive power, are they really the same things? And what about executive power in capitalism makes it different? And then my question for Georg is, it would be great if you can respond to Andreas's earlier question about, what do you mean that the task of the left is the fight between capital and labor and those at the top versus those at the bottom?
Maybe you want to begin?
So on the question of, thank you for giving me the opportunity to clarify. Part of this process that I've characterized as something like a neoliberal withering away of the state, part of that was empowering executives at the expense of legislatures. And you see that pattern repeating across all liberal democracies, but particularly in the European Union. So supranational integration allows for national decisions to be made on the basis of executive authority through the right of the executive to undertake foreign relations at the expense of national legislative bodies. And so, quite the opposite, in fact, it's been what we've seen is the empowerment of the executive as part of the disintegration of social agency. What I'm suggesting is partly, and it's not a complete answer to the problem, but it is a necessary component of an answer. If we are to restore social agency, then it requires restoring legislative power and containing and constraining executive power. And so concentrating public power in Parliament, for instance, would be a much better model, it seems to me, in the British context at least, as opposed to enhancing executive power. And the power of the Crown or the Prime Minister's authority under that. And that would repeat, I think, it seems to me, it's a viable model for all Western liberal democracies, because it seems to me they confront similar problems of overmighty executives at the
So is Liz Truss executive or legislative in she specifically, her mandate that she's voted on?
Well, I mean, she was the Prime Minister and she had executive power as her authority as the Prime Minister. In the classic kind of model of British parliamentarianism, it's kind of the Crown and Parliament. In the situation that we're in now, with the kind of growing presidentialism of the Prime Ministerial Office, cabinet government, and the structure of the British bureaucracy in the British state, that's the executive, and Parliament, the authority of Parliament, has been curtailed. But I think boosting legislative authority at the national level is what I would propose as the solution to our political, not a complete solution, but as the beginning of a solution to our political problems throughout the liberal democratic world.
I'm not 100% sure what of what I said is unclear, so I'm just going to try to make it with an example for it, and then maybe you have to ask me again if it's unclear. Like Marx said, history is a history of class wars, and so with this in mind, I would say, for example, to realize that the Somalian family in the flat next to mine is not a threat to me. Instead, we have the very same interest, and that is getting rid of the housing company that's squeezing all the money out of me and of him or of them. I would say is the core duty of any functioning left, to make clear who is the enemy, who's profiting, who not, who's on my side, who not. And because the left didn't do this in the last decades, only because of that it was possible to distract us and divide the class by made up dividing lines that aren't really there, I would say. Does it make sense to you? Some people do look a bit confused, so speak up if it made more things unclear with my statement.
That's what you mean by the struggle between capital and labor?
Yeah.
All right, non-Platypus members.
Forgive me if this question sounds a bit trite, but what does the left have to offer in terms of a compelling vision? The complaint I would lodge is the same complaint I would lodge against anyone who calls himself a post-liberal. You are able to offer critique of what's going on in the current systems and compelling critique, but what is your compelling vision of the future? Leftism in the early 20th century, as you rightly described it, was utopic, but that had a compelling, concrete vision. How do you respond to the problems today in terms of how do we address it? What is your vision? What do we actually do, roll up our sleeves and propose?
I suppose that's addressed mainly to Georg and maybe Andreas, since they're not. Go ahead.
I can start because I really like the question. And yeah, we're critique. So we're having a lot of critique here and saying what wasn't, all of the stuff that wasn't done. What I'm doing the whole day, or what I have been doing in my work at the Communist Party in Austria, and what I'm now trying to do with many others in Germany, is like exactly the organizing work I was talking about, making a difference in people's everyday life, showing that there is a real force, there are politicians, there is a party that is caring for the real problems people have. By doing so, building up a movement or gaining strength, gaining trust, to make it reasonable again, to go for the huge topics, to go for the big deals. Because, as I said, at the moment you can't hope to change the course of the world without any strength in your back. That would be idealism that would have to lose, definitely. And I would say, as I understand it, this is what every huge communist, socialist, leftist in any way movement ever did if it had any parts of success. Of course, we wouldn't have to sit here and discuss if earlier movements were successful in the sense that they overthrew capitalism, but they were way closer, way more successful in building up the power they need, in finding ways to confront the almighty capital. And so I would say, this is what I'm doing the whole day. And sometimes I get distracted from doing this by being asked in interviews or in couches what my critique of the rest of the left is. But this is not what I normally do.
Sorry about that. Yeah, thank you for the question. I'd say Platypus pretty much does the same things than everyone else on the left. The only difference is, and I'm going to be a bit polemical here, that we sort of do it self-consciously. What I mean by this is that, through this framework of critique that we sort of take on as a working hypothesis, which is the death of the left, which is the regression of thought, like the regression, you could say, of theory and praxis into thinking and doing, which is obviously something like you need to become aware of before you want to go to the working class and tell them about their interest in killing capitalists. So I'd say there is a necessity in learning to taking your own thoughts seriously for any kind of political practice you want to embark upon. And that necessity to take seriously what your seemingly spontaneous intellectual impulses will come up with, that necessity is historically mediated. This is something I really do think is absolutely necessary for any kind of serious thought about our present moment. That is to understand, how it is conditioned by a missed opportunity and by a failure. What is the historical condition of that which seems most logical, most immediate, and most natural to us? These are questions that are fundamental to any kind of political project today. And to round this off, there is a real need for intellectuals in this society. I think this place speaks to that, I think, or maybe it does, I don't know. So there is a need to actually, ask bigger questions. There is a need to realize how fundamentally nihilistic our time is and how fundamentally closed off our political horizons are. And the only way how to realize this is by actually thinking about history, by learning, by engaging, by, producing better symptoms of the death of the left.
I'll reach to studying deeper history again and to the question of withering away of the state. Both the First and Second Internationalist political projects, namely the Bolshevik and the SPD's attempted power in the early 20th century, were not predicated on the German and Russian state being strong enough or being able to execute a certain kind of policy, on the state, right? What they were predicated on was existence of an agent that was able to consciously shape society and take the steering wheel of history in its own hands. And Marx's point from the Paris Commune was that the working class will not be able to take in its hands the machinery of the state, rather it will need to smash it. And the state that will need to wither away would be the socialist state sometime in the future, hoping that maybe new social relations would come up. And what I hear here is, first of all, an enormous amount of desperation and a sort of just frustration at capitalist systems' inability to reconstitute itself and create a new configuration that would, deal with the crisis of the welfare state and that would provide a sort of functioning framework for the next 30 or 40 years of capitalism. And it is, because it is unable, this crisis continues, right? No one was really able to politically master a coalition that was able to take it happen. But I think it's quite remarkable that both Malcolm and Philip reach to sort of abstract, deus ex machina from the state that will come in and through the change of the way we mediate political power will be spared and the people will be able to express their will, rather than actually asking for the deeper question, which is who's the agent and what sort of agency is needed and what sort of subjectivity is needed in society. And I'd be really interested to hear what you both make of Georg's party efforts to organize such subject and to organize society and to organize society politically to take up on that. Is it adequate, or is there something fundamentally missing in those politics? Or maybe is what holding Georg's back is precisely his commitment to the communist label and to the red banner and to the whole of the history, even though, of course, I recognize that you also distance yourself from that, but the name is still there, right? So I sort of call on the speakers to take up this question of this real existing political project that you have on your couch.
Can you explain what you meant by distancing myself from?
Reading, sort of, doing leftist politics for non-leftists, right? The KPO, meaning that the KPO is sort of proclaims itself to be leftist politics for non-leftists, for normal people, for people who are not, obsessed sectarians, who are that was my, understanding of distancing yourself, right, from the sort of reaching out the FPO voters, right?
Not distancing from anything communism. Probably.
All right, what would that mean, right?
So I feel I should set the record straight here on one point here. I'm not calling for, and I'm certainly not expecting any sort of deus ex machina to come and, save the situation, like that isn't coming back home. When we're talking about like the welfare state, I'm sorry, like the Swedish welfare state, which is the one I know best, it's not going to be reconstituted, it's not going to be saved. It was built for a completely different time.
Right, but what I meant by reconstitute itself is not bring back the welfare state from the 50s. I meant to bring out a new arrangement of capitalism that would provide a certain, modicum of stability
Okay, well,
the future. Of course, that's not, 50s are not coming back.
Yeah, they're not coming back, and I don't expect the state to step up and come up with an alternative. I think unless someone, and it's not going to be the state, comes up with an alternative, we're just going to live in a situation where there is no alternative. There is no welfare provisions, and people who get sick, they're just going to be left on the street to die. I think that is actually the most probable outcome. I'm not a big fan of it, but again, my point here is that anyone who puts any sort of hope into the state, coming in and doing saving the day, these people are fundamentally mistaken. It's not happening. So, regarding the political subject, one of the problems you see, and this has become incredibly clear with the war in Ukraine, is that our societies have transformed internally to the point where, talking about bringing back the good old days of the SPD and these big unions, or the cradle to grave state, like the Social Democrats in Sweden, controlling all of the local presses, and if you died, your family would go to the funeral parlor owned by the Social Democratic Party, and it was this entire society in miniature. That world is also dead. There was an article series about the fact that Sweden is supposed to be this big arms manufacturer, right? People who don't know much about Sweden, they know about Saab, they know about Bofors. Well, there's a huge problem. Everyone who knows how to make stuff like dynamite, and again, remember who the inventor of dynamite was. Everyone who knows how to make dynamite, because you can't just make it home in the kitchen sink. You need sort of an engineering education and then sort of a specialist chemical sort of program on top of that, because otherwise you're going to blow yourself up, quite literally. And the thing is, everyone who knows how to make dynamite and explosives in Sweden is 65 years old and older. There's no, everyone stopped becoming engineers and stopped learning this stuff, so the people actually making the stuff needed inside mines for artillery shell production and so on, all of them are, they're pushing towards pension, or they're literally pushing up the daisies. And once these people are gone, there's not going to be any sort of...
But this is a question about policy. This is a question about the crisis not being able to produce enough shells. My question is, if there is to be a change,
No, I'm pointing this out because who is the revolutionary subject or the subject creating a new society going to be? Is it going to be PewDiePie, who is really great at making YouTube videos?
Why wouldn't it be the Communist Party of Austria or its counterpart in Sweden?
Yeah, but again, the reason I bring up this point of material production is that the material production is now gone. And it's not being reconstituted, it's not gonna be reconstituted. Young people today, they're doing other stuff that's outside of, producing, the computers, they stream on Twitch or whatever. And so, if we stop creating a perfect communist party or whatever, is this gonna be the communist party of YouTubers?
But it's just not true. Most people have normal jobs and work in society, and they could be organized.
They can't be organized to make stuff like explosives anymore. That's a thing we've lost, clearly.
Well, okay, if that's never coming back, it means we can just fold shop and just kind of.
Well, I'm pointing this out because there are actual limitations in terms of how society, how the classes are constituted right now, that were not in operation. If you start...
So what you're saying about the KPO's limitations... Sorry.
We need to allow Martin to speak.
Yeah, I'm just saying that, like, I'm not making any particular, like, in-depth point about specific policy here. I'm using the question of, can a country like Sweden, which is supposed to be like the expert at manufacturing dynamite, produce dynamite? The question is no, and it's not because of, like, I don't know, right-wing ideology or whatever. It's because of, like, material changes in the class composition of Swedish society. And you cannot really apply the model of the Sweden that had people who knew how to make dynamite and expect them to translate. Like, these things are actually going to have huge impacts on, like, what the horizon of the possible is.
Thanks. So I certainly didn't say, I hope it didn't come across that I thought the state is a desert machina to save us. Quite the opposite. The whole point of what I'm saying was the state isn't going to save us because it's falling apart. The only thing it knows is, sending cops to chase people down for what they say on Twitter. They abandoned, they kind of had a civil disturbance in Harehill in Leeds the other night, and they let it happen. They just withdrew. So I think what we're seeing is the opposite of a desert machina. So the program, it seems to me, isn't necessarily, but that isn't something which you restore just through having more police. You need a state which has public authority. It's a choice whether or not you wish to be political or not. If you wish to be apolitical, then that seems to me a choice. But questions of politics necessarily concern questions of state power, and I am suggesting that there is a path through some of our problems, both inherited and novel, which requires a willingness to constitute authority rather than merely to resist it, and to constitute power rather than merely rejecting it or rebelling against it, which is has been the default mode of the left for more than 100 years. The agent, it seems to me, has to be the nation. As we're reconstituting states, then the agent, and that agent isn't present at the moment, and it itself has to be constituted. And this question goes to the question of vision. The vision, what a gentleman asked at the back, if there is a vision, the vision, it seems to me, it has to be that of nation building. And that is the current historical context in which we're in. That is the political task of the day. And it's a political task partly which is born of regression. But be that as it may, it's the task that confronts us. And there is nobody coming to save us, certainly not the state.
Thank you. Right, non-Platypus member, particularly positioned from the right. You're not a Platypus member?
I see Benjamin, sorry.
Thank you. I'm just wondering, from a position of leftist organization in our current moment, Pierre and I often talk about how cities feel like it's kind of impossible to build a community in such a cosmopolitan city, and particularly from an urban perspective, how might the left attempt to invoke this universal injunction of an economic model when people might not be able to have that consensus? Gosh, I'm sorry.
Quite okay.
I have a terrible migraine.
You got a question out anyhow?
Is the sort of thrust of that the inapplicability of these old kind of categories of class in specifically a kind of cosmopolitan urban environment where people are sort of identifying with other things, right? Yeah. Take up the
So this might not, this might not directly address your question, Benjamin, but it does seem to me that the experience of modern urban life is, again, it's a political artifact. It's a deliberate cultivation of fragmenting society into competing groups, different communities that are all vulnerable in some way and that require to be policed by a central authority precisely because they don't trust each other and precisely because there is no larger sense of any kind of cohesive collective political identity. And those were political choices. Those were deliberate, it seems, the result of very often conscious, but not always conscious, perhaps semi-conscious strategies to dilute the basis and the possibility of democratic majoritarianism. And so it seems to me that ties in very directly to the experience of of the globalized metropolis that you have as the kind of default urban model across the Western world. And that, again, it seems to me the political response to that is to attempt to build political collectivity across those competing groups and to try and draw people out of their self-enclosed collective identities, whatever they may be, whether it's like kind of a religious community or kind of I don't know, modern gay identity in urban dwelling or something, whatever it is. Like, all of those communities, it seems to me, can be drawn together in new political identities, but it requires political work.
I don't know how to answer your question, but I do know something else, which is how to make everyone depressed. So I'm going to do that. Because I think that you center something that's pretty important here, and I think like Phil's answer is like, as far as I can surmise, like a step in the right direction. I would just add to this like problem that you highlighted another problem which is very like interconnected, which is the fact that not only do we have a crisis of like social organizations in these big cosmopolitan metropoles, we also have a crisis of these big cosmopolitan metropoles, at least in some cases, being on a crash course with reality. So this is particularly evident in America. So you have New York, you have cities like San Francisco, to a lesser extent Los Angeles, and then you have like the complete horror show that is Phoenix, Arizona. But for New York, for San Francisco, basically these cities, they are probably headed in the same direction as Detroit, in the sense that what's happening right now is that like all these office properties that used to drive the economy are now standing empty. And this is cratering the tax revenues of the city, which leads to lower service, which leads to less and less companies wanting to have like office space and so on, which leads to lower revenue, and it becomes a vicious cycle. So we've had like this period of everyone moving to like these big magnet cities, sort of embodied at its height in like movies like American Psycho or whatever, with like the yuppie generation being shown as like all of these psychopaths. But at least like they could have this corner office and this business card competition and stuff. If that goes away, and if like New York starts sort of ejecting people, like you could have like the California Dust Bowl, like a lot of people being essentially becoming refugees from like dysfunctional, like formally dynamic, like metropoles. And how do you organize those people? Like that's an even more intractable question, I think. And just to say something about Phoenix, Arizona, like that's a city of several million in the US that's not going to be around in like 40 years because they will have run out of water. So we're not just talking about like, this is our new way of life that's going to last forever, like these big cities. Like what do we do if the big cities, at least some of them, become pretty unviable? Like where are those people supposed to move? How are they going to identify themselves as like political subjects? I'm just leaving that out there to be unhelpful.
Maybe I can give it a try because normally I'm not that bad at giving hope. Speaking of the competing groups and fractured society, this is exactly where we as a Communist Party in Austria, are starting because in a society where everyone is just reduced to an individual and not having anything in common, you obviously can't do anything. So we're trying to bring back the feelings of like common interests and of common activities, and by organizing that, bringing people together that would normally be in fractured competing groups. And what I see is that there is a huge desire for exactly that. It's working so well because no one else is doing. That is why we're also not really competing with the other parties, because they're not doing this. And they don't have any interest in organizing society and being present in everyday life. And that there is such a huge desire for that, because people feel that they are alone with their problems and that something is obviously not right and no one else is caring for. So what I hear all day is, finally someone's caring, you should, finally someone sees our problems, finally someone listens, and this is the basis for everything we're doing, I would say. And of course, we're not just social workers, but by doing so and making clear who is not interested in being present, that, for example, the state or the rich are not caring at all, and makes a building through all the stuff we're doing, building class consciousness. I would say, that's what's ending the competing groups and forming a party that's working on in the same interest. If you ask a random stranger in Salzburg right now, I would say the chance is pretty high, if they vote for us or not, that they acknowledge that what we're doing is in their interest, and that's what we're doing is making their neighborhood better. I would say this chance is already pretty high, even if we're just doing it for a few years, not because we're geniuses, but we're the only ones who are doing so. So I would say the field is open for us, we just have to do it for some years.
Okay, I think so. We should probably try and wrap up at about 8. So we probably have time for just a couple more questions.
Who in Platypus has the best question?
I have the most naive questions.
if it's quick, you're not a member.
Yeah, now I am.
Come on.
So I have one question to you, Jörg. You're talking a lot about organizing, and I really appreciate this because I really believe in this way of doing politics. But I want to find out if we have the same idea of this, and to find out this, I might ask the question: for what do you do this? I mean, in the beginning of your talk, you were pointing out the successes of the KPÖ in getting elected in Salzburg and having are really connected to the society, connected to the people who are really in need of kind of help. So the first question is, for what do you do this? Do you do this for being elected, or is there something more behind this? And my other question would be, you say the problem of the left during the last decade is that they didn't do this kind of strategy. So, but I think there were some, and there were also some before, like in the 80s, the Maoists, and a descendant of this is the MLPD in Germany. I think they do similar things. So what would you say what you guys do differently? And why this is so hopeful.
Yeah, of course there are others who are doing it. For example, the MLTPD, I would say, just as far as I know, some very old guys doing this in not like the smartest way, but also behaving like nasty old guys very often, so they're obviously not so interesting for many people. Is the final goal being elected? No, not at all. It is just one of many tools. Being elected gives money, gives power, gives resources we can then use to further organize society, take more power. I would say kind of become the state in a sense, not like telling the state he should do this or that, but just doing it and building up the power to do so. Without being in any government. And so I would say this is way more our approach. And of course being elected on the way helps, as long as it doesn't distract you by becoming part of the system. So we have many rules to make sure that we stay like out of the system, of the logics of the system as much as possible. For example, our elected officials give away most of their money so that they're not drawn into it, and stuff like that. So I hope that helps. And I would say Salzburg is we just do this stuff since a few years, or my comrades do it, but you can tell that in Graz, in the city of Graz, they are doing it since the 90s, and they have their success since the 1990s, and it's still going up. They're still gaining power, and I would say they're still doing a pretty good job in not becoming part of this system, even if they're doing it for some decades now. So I would say it could be. Oh wait.
I do need to say, like, to strike a bit in the chord that you raised, Malcolm, and say something, to pour a bit of cold water. I'm from Graz, I grew up there, and I have to say, like, the KPÖ there has, as far as I know, I think about 300 members. At the same time, they are running the city. And they will be in charge of austerity politics in the city of Graz. Not because they want to, obviously not, but because they are forced with, a major political problem, being in an executive position, even on the city level. So I'm just like, there are problems like this approach runs into,
Yes, and in the end it can be that in some years, decades, we have to state that yes, this was the beginning of the downfall, that we became part of this logics. But I would say, as long as you never stop making clear that yes, even if you have 100% of all people in the city of Graz wanting something different, you have higher powers that stop you from spending the money you want. If you make clear all the time that you want something different and you do everything you can to do something different, I would say it still can be a way, and people know this. And then you have to aim for the higher, for the state level, for example, and say, okay, if we want to change in Graz, anything in Graz, we have to go for the state level. Let's go for the state level, for example. Let's go for the EU, if you would know movement in all the member states. But yeah, will it work? I'm not so sure, but I don't know any better way.
Right. Yeah.
Do we have an yes?
Okay, Pierre has asked me to ask a question. Maybe I'll ask you a bit about populism as such, because one of the very obvious things that's happening in South America and parts of Europe, despite the attempts of the democratic process to prohibit people from actually participating in it when their views are deemed unacceptable, is to say something like, well, one of the things we have to explain is why populism of the right, or centre-right, or as it's usually called far-right, it isn't, but is working, right? So what is the appeal of populism? Well, one of those things would be something like a recognition of the real concerns and values of people in their everyday lives. So things like family and nation and the existing social bonds that still exist despite the best efforts of the technocratic left and the technocratic state. And I think there's a huge branding problem for the left, which is to say, I think when people hear the word left, they think lockdowns, they think of all of these actually not emancipatory projects that have been factually supported by people describing themselves as left. I appreciate that we're talking about a kind of anti-leftist Marxism, which at the very least is an analysis, right? It's striving to present a critical analysis of the relationship between capital and labour, and to explain to people how the world actually works. And I'm not sure that message is really getting out. Academics are not really explaining things particularly well at the moment, I would say. I think institutions have become very ideologically hidebound. And I suppose it's one of the problems I think is that this fusion of progressivism with an image of the left as a whole, and this is bad news for any serious left, because most people are very much opposed to technocracy and some of the frankly insane ideas that are being pushed by so-called leftist publishers like Verso and so on, which are actually destructive of social bonds. So I'm just wondering if you could talk about populism, why populism of the so-called right, or centre-right, or right, what is it doing right? Why are people into populism, first of all? And second of all, how does the left rebrand itself as something actually useful, at least analytically, if not socially? Because people do have social bonds, people do have families, they do go to church. I mean, there are existing social bonds and ties that, we don't have to create everything from scratch all the time. I mean, this is a fantasy and a delusion of the left, I would say. The idea that there's nothing there and people have to come along and build these new organisations. No, I mean, it's already there, right?
Thank you very much. That was a great question. I think Phil was itching to come in.
Yeah, if I may. So, I suppose my thoughts are political rather than. I think some revival of associational civic life is a necessary part of any improvement to our current status. But I don't have any prescriptions for that. Beyond what many other people would say. But I can offer what I think are political solutions to some of these problems. And I think, though, the appeal of populism is quite evident, and I think you described it quite effectively as to why people find populism appealing. It's also very clear to me, and I think it's already visible, probably to people, to voters as well, to some degree, is that it will necessarily fail as a political alternative, and that it in fact already is failing. And that I think is very visible in the European Union, where you have a complementarity, in fact, between populism and the supranational technocratic structures of the European Union. And it makes perfect sense, because both share an antipathy to the idea of representation. So for populists, the idea is that there is, you only need a kind of a charismatic individual to channel the grievances of disaffected voters against this kind of remote elite. And the idea of institutionalizing these long-term mediating and representative structures, that isn't really in the populist toolkit. The populist toolkit is channeling the grievances, the charismatic leader, and that's all we need to do. And that fits very well with the technocratic supranational model, which is predicated on hostility to institutionalized representation at the national level too. And so I think what you're seeing is precisely like people like Giorgia Meloni, for instance. She puts out the policies making it more difficult for same-sex couples, lesbian couples to register their kids, having birth certificates that register them both as parents of their kids. And it's very obviously that's the kind of thing you do when you don't have an independent currency. When you can't control interest rates, you're not going to get the Italian demographic problems as long as they remain in the Eurozone. They're not going to be having enough babies. And so it seems to me, there's that deep complementarity, and that is emerging now with the populist wave in Europe, the EU they're going to remain in reform, which is what the Corbynist left wanted to do. The populists are doing it very well. They've abandoned any idea of seceding from the European Union, and they find it in fact very hospitable. So the appeal of populism is clear, and I think it's becoming more evident over time that it does not offer the solutions that we need.
Yeah, I'd like to, I agree with most of your analysis, Philip. I would just add that I think that there's another explanation for why these forces kind of fail constantly that's not necessarily opposed, but at least complementary, which is, and you kind of alluded to it, even though you didn't name it, which is like these people are confronted with like actual state failure or a limitation to state capacity. So Meloni is a perfect example, and I'll sort of add the example of the Sweden Democrats. But to start with Meloni, what does she do? She comes in promising like social, all of the good stuff, the left economics plus like social conservatism, like we shouldn't have all of these damn immigrants because like the situation is unsustainable. And in a way, like, yeah, you can sort of understand where people saying that are coming from, given like the problems that Italy has or believes it has. But then suddenly Meloni realizes that, oh shit, like the state apparatus that I'm now in control of, like the welfare system is not built for, 1.2 kids or whatever, and I don't control the currency. So suddenly we shouldn't have less immigration, we should have more. And at the end of the day, the stuff that remains that you can actually influence without, actually having to do some serious work, like becoming some sort of almost a revolutionary. It's like, yeah, okay, well, there are some lesbians, we can make life sort of symbolically worse for them or whatever. And it's like, yeah, okay, you can kick a bunch of lesbians around because like they don't really matter that much in the grand scheme of things. It's an easy target, and you can say, well, I'm socially conservative, I'm doing things. But like, that's because you've taken one look at the actual guts of the machine and said, like, I can't fix this. The Sweden Democrats are the same way. They used to be like the most EU skeptic country, or party in Sweden, and they were incredibly NATO skeptic. And then suddenly, without allowing for even a minute of floor debate on their convention, they said, like, we're the biggest fans of EU right now. And like a guy I used to work with, like Matthias Karlsson, who was the deputy party leader at one point, like he woke up one day and he realized that like Western values, like the greater West, blah, 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 like that's actually the real deal that needs to be protected, like the rules-based order, and not like the sort of parochial Swedish nationalism history that he had tooled around with earlier. And now suddenly you have like these nationalists going like, we can't let the Communist Party of China like smother the flame of democracy of Taiwan. And it's like, dude, what the fuck? Like, you're a Swedish nationalist. Taiwan is literally on the opposite side of the world. Nobody in Sweden in like 1600 AD or whatever was sitting around, oh gosh, I wonder what's happening on Taiwan right now. Like this is the thing that Swedes really care about. But you have to realize that for someone like Karlsson and for someone like Jomshof and Söder and everyone else in that party that do this like NATO talk at this point, this isn't because they've been mind controlled by aliens or the CIA has kidnapped their families. They're out of ideas. They straight up take one look at like the world and they go, holy shit, we didn't think about this. And then they flee into like, okay, we can find some lesbians to kick around or whatever, so people trick themselves into thinking we're actually doing something. But all of these big challenges, like what's the new security architecture post-Ukraine gonna look like? They're way above the pay grade. And this is the perennial problem with like, I feel like right populism, it's just like a Groundhog Day loop of like the Bernie era. Where it's like, okay, well, how are we going to deal with the $175 trillion sort of deficit projected for all of the social services in the US. Oh, we don't know, but we're gonna say something cool in the here and now. And like, this hasn't really changed.
Great. I think that's probably going to be the last question. So, Gail or Andreas, do you want to? Okay, we'll take another question, if there is one.
Who's neither a member nor not a member?
Alternating back.
You've had your hand for quite a long time.
Sorry.
Oh no.
Oh.
Are you okay?
This is chaos.
I'm okay. Are you okay?
Anarchy.
Is the floor okay?
Let's leave the floor for a moment.
Okay,
Let's carry on. Sorry about this. Just go for it.
Yeah, sorry. Hi everyone. So this is going to sound like a trick question, and it might be a trick question. And this is specifically for Phil and Malcolm. And then I have another question for you, Kurtz, G. Kurtz. I can't remember your first name. So for Philip and Malcolm, at what point? Let me get my notebook.
This better be really good.
When did you make the realization, when did you have the realization that your own left politics or education in the left, or what you received from the left, was not adequate to understand and change the world or deal with how it is? And why not become conservative? Why not take up the right? You do not need the history of Marxism to, advise the next council, or advise the next party of the UK, or advise the next American government or Swedish government. And from Georg, why do you think it does work? What is it about the left that is adequate to addressing society at the moment, and what do you feel actually works about it? Okay.
That's good.
Yeah, I guess I'll start. Like, the moment I really seriously realized that the toolbox might be broken in a fundamental way. There's been different times, but like the really sort of traumatic point was really the Ukraine war. And that kind of answers why the right isn't a particularly good alternative. Because again, like, my realization with the Ukraine war was like, this sort of entire security economic order is falling apart, and like nobody knows how to drive this train. And like, European politicians were saying like, this is gonna be great, like we're gonna win in 5 days or whatever, and they had no conception what they were getting into, and now they managed to completely destroy like not just like the rules-based order, but also like the economic underpinnings of like the system they were in charge of. And so at that point, you kind of realize that like the issue here is that everyone on the plane seems to have forgotten how to fly it. And so in some ways, it actually affirmed my belief in like the old sort of Marxist, in quotations, like analytical toolbox, because you need some way to try to analyze this stuff at least, because nobody has a plan right
now. Start, because it was the same question for you.
Sure. So I can't give, I can give a kind of a longer answer and a shorter answer. The longer answer is, I was kind of dabbling in one form of radical left politics when I was in.
You read a book?
I did. More than one. But kind of my kind of political awareness, I suppose, began around the anti-capitalist, anti-globalization protests of the late 1990s. So this kind of quasi-anarchism, and through all sorts of kind of convoluted paths. And I taught Marxism for about 10 years, at the University of Kent and also taught conservatism at the University of Kent for a slightly shorter time, about 8 years, if memory serves. But throughout that period, it was very clear to me that, and I always taught Marxism like this, that it was, or tried to at least, that it was the history of a failed politics. And the challenge was to understand, precisely because its ambitions were so great, and the stakes of its understanding and its claims were so dramatic, that it was a tremendously challenging and stimulating thing to understand, but also a necessary thing to understand our current politics. So from my early encounters with Marxism as a radical politics, it's always come from the understanding that it's also a defeated project. When I've changed, or my views kind of shifted gear to something more politically active rather than thinking through the ruins, I guess, is with Brexit. We had a very decisive and importantly working class challenge to the existing constitutional order in the UK, the most class correlated vote in decades, and one that was so clearly politically aimed in that very basic idea of taking back control. That people wanted greater public power, and they wanted greater control, political control over their lives. That showed me that there was actually a way to break through the impasse of neoliberal and post-Cold War politics. That's the long answer. The short answer is why not become a conservative is because I don't want to conserve. I want change. So there's nothing that I see particularly that I wish to conserve politically at least. And so from that point of view, a political program of change means that I can't be a conservative. And all the conservatives seem to be interested in the project of state failure or indifferent to it. And that's something that's not what I support. And the project of nation building that I do support is a project of change.
Thank you for the great question. I really like it. Why do I feel it works? Because I see that the people we're aiming for feel that it works, and this is what I would say is the proof in these cities in Austria where the KPÖ is building up. The people we reach out for have the feeling that it works, and at some point, you said this so well before, it is okay on rare occasions like this to consciously look at our own and discuss in our own circle. But besides that, the rest of you go out, do things, talk to normal people, make yourself useful. At some point, it is enough debated between us, and you have to test your assumptions if they actually work. And if not, try others. If they work, go forward. And to bring ourselves finally in a position again where we can legitimately talk about stuff like Lenin revolutions without making us completely laughable, because in reality we don't have any power at all for any revolution. So to bring us back in a situation where we can even fail because there is at least a chance to win, we have to go out and organize and get started. And yeah, in the end, if it will work, no one knows. It never worked so far. But I would say that's the best chance we have to do it. Fail, learn from the failing, look at the historic failures, discuss what we have to change, try again. This is how it, I would say, always worked. This is like progress within the left. And I would say at the moment, yeah, this is the KPÖ and also the Belgian, what's the name in English? Partei der Arbeit, PTB Workers' Party in Belgium are trying a similar approach, and they also have success with that. I would say that's the best approach I know so far, and that's why I would say go out and try your approach if you think you have a better one, or try this one. But at least keep trying.
Yeah, like there is a cynical side of me that wants to say, well, we need to test our assumptions in practice, and that would look like, you know, trying to advise the state of Italy how they have more children in the future. Like, is that the assumption we want to test? I mean, to be more serious, I think there is a really interesting theme come out for me, and we can discuss this further afterwards, like out of this discussion, and that is actually the same theme I wanted to draw out at the beginning in terms of the state, in terms of the relationship, I would say, of society to the state, because all of you emphasize different aspects of something that actually you raised in your question. In my opinion, that would be progressivism. I think the concept of rebuilding national sovereignty as a serious form of political authority, to me very much is haunted by the question of progressivism of the 20th century. I would say the same thing about the left becoming the state, you know, and like being able to actually implement the policies that would help people. And the same thing goes for, I think, you know, the specter or the danger you raised, Malcolm, you know, when you described the scenario that would, you know, what would happen if the welfare state really, you know, went away. To me, that sounded in a way like politically as a plea for it to stay. I mean, again, this is like...
No, it was actually just a question of what would happen.
Sure, but it didn't sound very, it didn't sound like it was a great opportunity.
No, but I do think that, like, today people need to ask these questions, like,
right,
without any sort of, just very quickly. Like, when it's easy to go like, oh, well, what would happen if the welfare state disappeared? That means he's some sort of doomer, like, spreading bad mojo. I don't necessarily think that, like, the history is written. Like, our main predicament today is that we have all of these oncoming trains in some way, and it's a legitimate question. Like, presumably, human society is going to continue, right? Even if there's no welfare state. Presumably, like, there will still be people in 100 years or whatever. So how will that look like? I don't know the answer, which is why I'm asking it not as a, like, it's going to be really bad unless you join my political party or, like, pay me $10 or whatever. It's just genuinely, like, what's going to happen? We don't know.
Thanks for that clarification. And so the thing I wanted to raise in response to that, like also to your question, is I don't think that populism, or let's say that the dichotomy, which seems to have also like, which is very prevalent still, like the dichotomy between populism and technocracy, in that sense, like the technocratic EU institutions on the one hand and the populist coming from left and right. I mean, the book, The Populist Moment, right, by Anton Jäger and Arthur Borelli, just have been released, which, you know, it's very much about the left populism, like the 2010 to 14, 15. So I don't think that that is a very productive framework for understanding what is happening today. I think it actually like takes us back to a deeper problem, to the beginning of the 20th century, to the question of progressive versus conservative capitalism, in that sense. And I think that, you know, might like show a different or provide a different aspect of the current crisis, and especially of the deep roots of the current crisis. That it could be that you know, there's a political formation for the last 100, that existed for the last 100 years, that is now in crisis. And you know, without a left that, and I would strongly agree with you there, Gail, without a left that is in any kind of position to intervene, to organize, to have a specific kind of political independence from the bourgeois state, from the bourgeois parties, I don't think we will be able to understand really what this crisis is about. And I think that should, you know, that fact alone should, in a way, like throw us back to the history of the left and the death of the left.
I think we'll finish there. That was a good turn.